Difficulty in the Zelda series has never really been consistent. You could give a game like Skyward Sword to literally anybody and they would be able to get the hang of it in a few hours. On the other hand, you could give Zelda 2 to somebody who plays video games all the time and they'll still beat their controller to death out of frustration before ever beating the game. Combat is the first thing I think of when measuring the difficulty of a game, especially a Zelda game. There are definitely other factors, but they aren't quite as important. The reason everybody hates Zelda 2, for example, isn't because of the puzzles or something, since there's barely any to begin with. The reason people hate Zelda 2 so much is because of the combat. It's very easy for a game to go too far and turn what should be a fair challenge into unfair garbage, and Zelda 2 definitely fell into that trap. There are a lot of difficult games out there that are still considered fair: Hollow Knight, Cuphead, Elden Ring before the disastrous late game, Celeste. Now look at Zelda 2. This right here, this is not fun. There needs to be a balance between difficult combat and enough room for error so that a regular person can still get through the game, and Zelda 2 failed that balance so badly that it became the most hated game in the entire series for that single reason. While Zelda 2 did go in the direction of making combat too difficult, there are unfortunately a few examples of games in the franchise which went too far in the opposite direction, with too much easy combat. Twilight Princess is a truly epic game with so much more dynamic combat than the games that came before it. You can unlock 7 different techniques, you can parry enemies with your shield, you can spin around them and do this crazy uppercut move, you can jump above them and catch them off guard. In many ways, the combat in Twilight Princess is the best it gets for the series, but every now and then it still feels underwhelming because it's so easy. You could use none of the special techniques in Twilight Princess and you would still be able to destroy nearly every enemy and boss with ease. When it comes to the combat, there isn't a real challenge in this game, and for the most part that is a negative thing. Sure, the low difficulty might make it more approachable for most players, but it also lowers the stakes by a lot. If I don't have to pay attention during the combat and I'm never at any real risk of dying, why would I be invested at all? The combat in Twilight Princess is still great, don't get me wrong, and it's arguably the best in the series, but it could have been so much more with a little bit more difficulty. Unfortunately, Twilight Princess is not the only Zelda game with underwhelmingly easy combat. The Wind Waker is possibly the easiest game in the series just because parrying is so broken. You can defeat most enemies in Skyward Sword by just spinning, and right after the early game in Breath of the Wild, the player becomes super overpowered. Most combat in the Zelda series sadly goes in the direction of being way too easy or way too difficult. There are only a couple games in the franchise that have very well balanced combat, and the best example is A Link to the Past. The combat in this game is exactly what you would want in a Zelda game. It's not confusing or frustrating, it's simple, it's very easy to pick up, but it's not a walk in the park either. Most boss fights or enemies will pose an actual challenge to the player, and you might die a couple times if you don't have a potion or two, but you'll never find yourself getting angry enough to quit. This game simply took the difficulty of the first 2 Zelda games and got rid of all the nonsense. Most deaths in this game do feel fair and justified, no matter how frustrating they are. Now, there are some restrictions in A Link to the Past's combat simply because it's a top-down 2D game instead of a 3D game, but nonetheless, this is a perfect example of well-balanced Zelda combat. With all of that being said, combat is not the only measurement of difficulty in the Zelda series. Puzzles are also a huge part of these games, and some of them are much harder to solve than others. Look at the Water Temple from Ocarina of Time, for example. This dungeon isn't going to kill you all the time, the enemies aren't very dangerous, but the puzzles are incredibly confusing, and navigating the entire area is a nightmare. When looking at dungeons in the Zelda series as a whole, the most difficult ones are definitely found in Majora's Mask. This game only has 4 dungeons, sure, but most of them are full of challenging puzzles and head scratchers. The last 2 in particular stand out to many people almost entirely for their difficulty. The Great Bay Temple is very confusing to navigate, and even visually it's hard to tell where you're really meant to go. The Stone Tower Temple, while not as confusing, is still really challenging since its puzzles use mechanics from the entire game, which is actually surprisingly not very common for the series. Majora's Mask is a pretty tough game for Zelda standards in general, and the dungeons are no exception. I've heard a lot about the dungeons in Oracle of Ages being very difficult as well, but I don't have much to say about that game since most people have never even played it. While Majora's Mask may have relatively difficult puzzles in its dungeons, there are still some other Zelda games with very easy dungeons. For example, Wind Waker? Yeah, once again, it's no secret that this game is super easy, but even more so than the combat, the puzzles in the Wind Waker are a piece of cake. I don't think I ever got stumped in one of these dungeons. I never had to ask a friend what to do next, and I never even had to look up a walkthrough. The Earth Temple is definitely a bit more challenging than the rest of the dungeons in the Wind Waker, and possibly the series, and utilizing the Mirror Shield mechanic and Medley was a little bit complicated, but outside of that particular area, everything having to do with dungeons in the Wind Waker is super easy. We aren't done quite yet though, because as most people know, puzzle solving in the Zelda series goes far beyond just the dungeons. Prior to Breath of the Wild, navigating the overworld in itself was full of obstacles and challenges. The Triforce quest in the Wind Waker, the Silent Realms in Skyward Sword, the Tears of Light segments in Twilight Princess. So which Zelda game is the most difficult in this regard? Well, once again, Majora's Mask is a pretty good contender. Navigating this game's world during the main quest gets pretty difficult sometimes, and there are a lot of roadblocks. I freely admit that there were some times I used a guide on the internet to get through Majora's Mask because I had no idea where to go next, and the game doesn't really tell you. Some of this stuff is truly confusing and difficult. One of my biggest memories in Majora's Mask was how tiresome it was just to reach the Great Bay region. First, you must acquire a horse, but before you do that, you're required to blow up this rock, but in order to do that, you need to get a special bomb called the Powder Keg, and the only way to get a Powder Keg license is to talk to this big guy and then go through his walkathon challenge, but don't forget that his shop is only available after beating Snowhead Temple, so if you have to reset time after defeating Goat like most people, you'll have to fight him again straight away. When I was running around the map trying to find out what I had to do at moments like these without a guide, I was left so confused. It really was a challenge. Despite that though, Zelda 1's overworld is way more confusing. Everybody knows that playing Zelda 1 without a guide is like cooking without any ingredients. The overworld is so cumbersome to navigate, the player is given basically no instruction on where to go next, and that's on top of the difficult enemies being spammed all over the map. Everyone says Zelda 2 is the most difficult game in the series, and that's perfectly fair, but my experience with Zelda 1 was far more challenging because I never knew where I was meant to go. When it comes to exploring the world, Zelda 1 is the most difficult game in the series by far. Yeah, Majora's Mask is pretty tough, Zelda 2 has some confusing moments thrown in there as well, but nothing can be worse than this. We've talked about the hardest Zelda overworlds to navigate now, but which Zelda game is the easiest to navigate? Wind Waker? I'm not elaborating on this. Difficulty in the Zelda series is usually pretty simple. You can play through a game once and judge how hard it is, but in a few Zelda games, well actually a lot of Zelda games, there are extra game modes thrown in there which are designed to make things more challenging. Notably, the second quest, Hero Mode, and Master Mode. The second quest game mode is exclusive to Zelda 1 and Zelda 2, and it's garbage. The second quest is particularly difficult in Zelda 1. Not only do the enemies become more challenging by default and there are more of them, but everything is completely scrambled. Certain shops and heart pieces are put in different locations, and that's already pretty bad, but what really matters is that the location of dungeons are changed as well. To add insult to injury, the entire game is flooded with even more cryptic puzzles, and the interior of every dungeon has a lot of garbage like invisible walls. More than ever, the player has to rely on a guide or quit the game, which is not only super difficult, but super boring. The second quest in Zelda 2 is also pretty bad, but it's a lot more excusable. Most of the problems in Zelda 2's second quest have to do with a lot of the fundamental Zelda 2 stuff that existed in the original experience, which actually makes it a lot easier to get used to if you like Zelda 2. The second quest option at the end of the day is just a torture method that insane people use in order to make the two hardest Zelda games even harder than they already were. My advice to anybody trying these game modes out is, try to have fun, if it's even possible. The Hero Mode is the next difficulty increasing game mode in the Zelda series, featured in the Wind Waker HD, Twilight Princess HD, Skyward Sword, A Link Between Worlds, and Link's Awakening on the Switch. This game mode is a lot better than the second quest in the first two games, but it's not the best either. Hero Mode is basically just a difficulty slider where you can take the games from easy to normal mode, and it's pretty lazy all things considered. All they really do with this setting is make it so that enemies drop slightly less hearts and deal more damage. It's not special at all. At least a huge Zelda 1 fan would be motivated to try out the second quest in Zelda 1 since it would be something new. A huge Skyward Sword fan is not going to see the Hero Mode option and get super excited to play it again because it's the exact same game with a couple of stat changes. Hero Mode obviously isn't a bad thing, and if somebody wants to revisit one of these games, it's a decent option to make things feel slightly more fresh, but I just wish there was a more recognizable game mode for increased difficulty with more unique mechanics. They could call it something like, I don't know, Master Mode? Master Mode is the last difficulty setting for the Zelda series, only being available in Breath of the Wild and for some reason not Tears of the Kingdom. The good news is, it is the best difficulty setting in the series by far. Whether you're somebody who adores the Master Mode or somebody like me who thinks it's just okay, it's easy to see that there were a lot of decent changes put into this mode and there was a lot of effort put into it as well. There aren't a million changes, but the ones that are present do make the Master Mode feel special. The different enemy placements, monsters being able to heal at pretty quick speeds, and an entirely new gold layer to the enemies can make your $20 seem somewhat worth it. It's not the best game mode ever, and it's not even that difficult once you get used to it and explore the world more, but for Zelda's standards, it's pretty neat. I would take something like Master Mode over a Hero Mode or a second quest any day. When it comes to difficulty in the Zelda series, we have now covered most of what there is to cover, so if there's anything to learn from this video, Zelda 1's a nightmare.